Today is October 14th, 2011. I'm Charles Lundquist. We're doing an oral history interview for the archives at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. And today we're emphasizing the history of the Research Institute of the university. Our guest today is Frederick I. Ordway III. Fred, we're delighted to have you here.
Delighted to be here, Chuck.
And let's start out with how you happened to get interested in Huntsville and how all this came about.
Well, I'm a New Yorker and New Englander. I was brought up in the Northeast United States. I was born in New York, raised in Westchester County and adjacent Fairfield, Connecticut. I did education in Massachusetts and a great deal of my education in Maine. And back in the 1950s, I had started to work with a company called Reaction Motors Incorporated, which was the first company that dealt exclusively with rockets. The second company was Aerojet, which formed about 2 or 3 months after Reaction Motors. We were formed in late 1941. And I was also working in that area at the Republic's Guided Missile Division in the early 1950s when I met Wernher von Braun. I met Wernher von Braun at a space flight symposium held at the Hayden Planetarium of the National Museum of the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. And it was quite an impressive event, and we sort of clicked. And one thing led to another. I was a director of the American Astronautical Society and editor of the Journal of Astronautics, and very active in the American Rock Society, which I joined barely as a teenager when I was 13 years old as a student member. And Wernher von Braun was often in New York because of these two principal space and rocket societies for many, many meetings, and we set up meetings, and one thing, it's a long story. But we sort of clicked as individuals. Never in my mind did that ever occur to me that I would come to Huntsville in those days. We just, and Wernher von Braun, believe it or not, one day asked me, he said, Fred, he called me Fred, I'm going to be up in your way in business on the North Shore of Long Island, and where should I stay? And I blurted out as a young engineer at the Republic at that time, well, you can stay with us. We happened to have a fairly large house. That's another story. And so we had Wernher von Braun at our home, and then he came up another trip with his wife, and we became social friends and very active at in these two societies. And then one day in 1956, he had talked to me about coming to Huntsville, working here in Huntsville. And it hadn't occurred to me really, and I hadn't paid too much attention to it until he sent a letter to me, which said that he really felt it would be the biggest error in my life if I didn't come to Huntsville, and offered me a position here, and I accepted. That's why I'm here today.
Well, very good. So that was just at the beginning of ABMA,
That was the beginning of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, which had been set up to develop the Jupiter missile, increase the capabilities of the Redstone missile and the new Jupiter intermediate range ballistic missile. But there's another little interim story in here, which was the Advanced Research Projects Agency, with which I had some contacts. And they were the ones that gave us the first contract, 58-1, I think it was, to develop a much larger propulsion system, which led to the Saturn I. In any event, he offered me, how are you going to turn that man down? So in early 1957, with my family and my dog, named Rocket, came to Collie, and we came down here to Huntsville and settled on Monte Sano, which at that time, when did you come here?
54.
It was called Kraut Hill.
Yes.
Because there were so many Germans living up there.
Yes.
And we were Yankees moving in there, and they said, the local people said if we could accept the Germans, we could accept the Yankees. And we got along well with everybody. We have beautiful relationships here with everybody we met.
What was your role in ABMA?
Well, I started off working, let's see now, I started off working for Oswald Lange in the Saturn Systems office, getting ready for working with him on the beginnings of the Saturn, what would have been the Saturn I propulsion. But then I no sooner had moved here, then they sent me to Washington. So I had to get up my family. We had a house here. We just closed it up and moved back to Washington. I was the guy in Washington that ABMA had to do all the interfaces with ARPA, which is called DARPA today.
Yeah. Liaison, I guess you call
I worked with many of the people there, and with the NASA, which had been created in October of 1958. But the Army didn't release its crown jewel, the von Braun team, until the middle of 1960. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So I moved back to Washington and was the spokesman and the guy that organized all the programs with Roy Johnson at ARPA and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and to a certain extent with the Air Force. And a little parentheses here, I served in the U.S. Navy for the last 7 months as a midshipman cadet in World War II. And we were given the option in those days to either go on to get your commission and do 2 years or get out, because that's what the huge demobilization of World War II. I had already been accepted at Harvard University, so I just got out and went to Harvard, still in uniform. But as soon as the Air Force was created back in 1957, they knew about my interest and expertise, I guess, in rocketry, and they offered me a direct commission. And I stayed in the Air Force Reserve for about some 25 years, training and going to annual two-week tours and so forth. So I also have that unofficial business working with the Air Force.
Surely.
And I had friends there. And sometimes we wanted to get some reports, and I still remember, I won't mention names, because that would be not appropriate, but we wanted to get some Air Force information that would be of interest to, maybe on Thor or something like that, to the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. And my friend, a colonel, and I won't mention his last name, said, "Fred, look, I'm going up to the men's room, and there's a report on my desk. If it's not here on my desk when I come back, I won't say anything."
Well, that's fine. So, did you stay then in Washington?
No, about a year, I guess it was, roughly a year. Again, I don't have all the dates because my files are out of the Space and Rocket Center. But when I came down for the official, not the big one, but the transfer of the Army, I think was in sort of
July 1st.
June, July 1st. Yep. I came down for that. And then, of course, I was here when General Eisenhower came here, President Eisenhower, with Mrs. Marshall, and I always thought about it, it stuck in my mind, one of the most incredible elements, memories in American history. Here was the former 5-star general running the whole European campaign with his mentor and boss, General George C. Marshall, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I guess he was the top guy at all. But Mrs. Marshall naming the center of the George C. Marshall Space Flight Center and turning it over to Werner von Braun,
yes,
ex-member of the German rocket team working for, World War II, sometimes called Nazi Germany. I never forgot that. I thought that was incredible. It stuck in my mind. I can remember every aspect of that watching President, I should say Marshall, President Eisenhower and Mrs. Marshall and Werner von Braun on that podium.
I was there too.
Yeah, so. I know you were. Yeah.
Very good. Well, then you stayed on with NASA for a while.
Yeah, I stayed on with NASA. That's a strange thing in my life. I stayed on with NASA during 1960, 61, 62, 63, and 64. I was traveled a great deal. I was all sent on missions and lectures. I lectured a huge amount in those days. And I went to, I was in New York in January of 1965. I guess it's not in my program that I told you, but I'll tell you about it. And one of my best friends was Arthur C. Clarke, who was the advisor to the Space and Rocket Center from, I guess, day one. He was the author of many, many books on space travel, and a major figure in the history of space travel. And I had met Arthur Clarke in 1950 at the first International Astronautical Congress in Paris. I was the only American present
Really?
at that first International Congress.
Is that right?
In late August of 1950. I was in Paris at the time. I was a graduate student working in my original field, which was petroleum and mining and geophysics. And I did 2 years of graduate work at the University of Paris. And I was there when they had this marvelous symposium in the Sorbonne at the Grand Salle Richelieu. And I met Arthur Clarke and many other people at that symposium. And in 1952, my wife and I were in Europe attending the coronation of Elizabeth I. And at that time, I was inducted into the British Interplanetary Society, and this is my 50th anniversary time.
How nice.
And Arthur Clarke later was in this 1952 trip. We became very, very close friends, and he inducted me into the society. Well, going back to 1965, in January, I was in New York for meetings with the American Rock Society and other, also presenting my final manuscript of a book called Intelligence in the Universe, written with Roger McGowan, who was one of the top guys at the Army computer lab, with Prentice Hall. And somebody mentioned along the way, by the way, Fred, I just heard that your good friend Arthur Clarke is in town. And I knew Arthur always stayed at the Chelsea Hotel on 23rd Street. And I called him, and he was there. And I said, how about dropping by the Harvard Club? I remember the Harvard Club from those days. And we had a nice evening at the Harvard Club. And then I had to leave because I had a dinner appointment. He had a dinner appointment and so forth. But he had just been contacted by Stanley Kubrick, who was the became the director of 2001: A Space Odyssey. And he told me all about what they were doing, and I told him all about the book we were turning into Prentice Hall that same trip, illustrated by Harry Longe. You may have met him. He was here for a long time.
Yeah, yes.
In Huntsville. And we talked about it, and then we finally said goodbye. I had to go off to my dinner at Park Avenue, and Arthur went somewhere else, and Longe somewhere else. And just before I was leaving the Harvard Club, it was in January, it was snowing, there was a telephone call. The front door man said, there's a telephone call for you while I was waiting for a taxi. And I thought it might have been the host or hostess, wondering if I was going to be able to get there because of the weather. And I picked up the phone, and it was Stanley Kubrick. And he said, my name is Stanley Kubrick, and I'd like to meet you. And so we set up a meeting with Arthur Clarke a couple of days later in his penthouse in New York, and that's how I got involved with 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I consulted from here for about 6 months, and I flew up on weekends to work with him. And then he finally said, Fred, we've got to have you in England during the entire production. I talked to Werner Brown, and he said, go for it, and you have some job when you get back. And that's where he began to think of me a little bit later about the Institute. Mm-hmm. And so I left for England and worked over there during 1960, from the summer of 65 through the summer of 66, and maybe a little bit later, whatever it was, the final dates, on 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was considered one of the, I guess, the 10 great films according to the American Film Institute.
Yes. Well, then you got another call from Werner von Braun in what, 67, you said?
Well, yeah, then he began to say, when you're coming back, in those days, there was a deal. I had been out of the country I'd worked with Kubrick for 6 months in the United States, and then a full year in England, but I needed to complete another 6 months to get 18 months to avoid taxes back in the States. So I paid some taxes in England, but not many. Mm-hmm. And so I worked with Fred Durant and did many museums all over Western Europe. Well, was also added to my collection. Doing work for him, and we became close associates. And I prepared a report on what space artifacts were in different museums throughout Europe. And so we get now into 67. And I'm getting close, I guess, to the time I'm coming back. And so what's next?
Well, you got a call from von Braun then, I believe.
I got a call from von Braun, and he said he had made contact with Dr. Rudolf Herman that he was setting up a research institute here in Huntsville, and that I might be interested in, instead of going back to Marshall, to coming here. And that intrigued me. I had never been, I have a university career at Harvard and the University of Paris, and I'd done semester courses at the University of Barcelona in Spain, which I have a diploma, University of Innsbruck, and even the University of Algiers.
Oh, really?
So
Algiers?
Well, that's because of a special course while I was at in the geosciences curriculum at Paris. They sent me down there for one semester to do some research on the geology of, my original jobs were in petroleum and mining engineering.
Yes, I knew that.
And so that's why I got down to Algiers. And so
Sure.
I got to, of course, North Africa at that time. Anyway, so that was the thought that I would, when I came back to the United States, when The Adventurers came into the picture, which is a film in my wife's country.
Mm-hmm. So you eventually came to the Research Institute then? Eventually
came to the Research Institute, and I enjoyed every minute of it, working with Dr. Rudolph Herman. And Ben Graves was a very good friend of mine. We were tennis buddies at the Huntsville Rocket Club. We just wasn't big buddies, tennis buddies. I knew him very well. And of course, Jack Porter and many, many other people here, Clyde Reeves. And I enjoyed my career here. I had many contacts with some of these 2001 Space Odyssey. A man named Bodo Bartoka, for example, was at the National Science Foundation when I started my job here, but he was at the Navy attaché in London during the 2001 Space Odyssey.
I see.
So I had a lot of inputs there, and we had programs that we were promoting with the National Science Foundation and with the Department of Health, Welfare, and I guess it was called, and Education those days, and of course NASA Marshall, and we got our Saturn History program started here and so forth.
Tell about the Saturn History program.
Well, one of the projects, there was Melvin Day, was a good friend of mine at NASA headquarters. I don't remember his exact title. Do you know him? Did you know him?
Yes, but not well.
Yeah, but I don't have my access to my files out there.
So I'm not sure what his
title was. But he was one of the top guys at NASA headquarters in not only in history but in documentation. And we had meetings with him in Washington, and with Dave Akins, who was a NASA historian down here, and Porter and Herman and many others. And we got the contract to put together all the archives of the Saturn History. And his Saturn History was eventually published by, was it Barton Hackett? I guess it was.
Who wrote it?
Yeah, he did.
Bill Stein.
What?
Bill Stein.
Well, Bill Stein was it? Yeah, there were various people. That's why I don't have access to the things up there. And John Belch was active in the early days of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
But he didn't finish it somehow.
No, he didn't finish it somehow because that's another story. Should I tell that story?
Sure, go ahead.
Well, we hired John Belch. One of my jobs was, before I became active full-time here, I had done some work on behalf of the Institute. And I traveled, I had many, because I've done a lot of work in the history, I had many friends out there. And I took a trip on behalf of the university when I was on leave, short leave from my job in South America. And I visited people that I knew quite well, Everett Mendelsohn at my university, Harvard, Derek de la Sola Price at Yale, Melvin Calvin at Carnegie Mellon, and so forth, many others. And we want to bring all these historians of science into our community here to give us support for bringing the Willie Lake collection down here later, and also undertaking programs here. And so I had done that before I was here full-time. I made a number of trips on behalf of the university before being here on full-time. And we were very, very keen on what we were going to do, and we finally did put that whole Saturn project together here. And I guess all those documentations, I suppose, are still here, aren't they?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
In fact, the young folks at Marshall, looking for historical facts about some piece of machinery or something, have to come here to find it.
Got to come here to find it. Okay.
So it's all there and cataloged.
That would some way lead to the Willie Lay collection, wouldn't it?
Yes.
The Willie Lay collection. Willie Lay was really the mentor of Werner von Braun, or one of the mentors of Werner von Braun, back in Germany in the 20s and 30s when von Braun became active in the German VFR, the German Interplanetary Society. But Willie Lay decided to leave Germany. Although he was from a Lutheran family, he had a Jewish great-grandmother. And he knew that, and the Germans, from Frederick the Great, and he explained this very carefully to me, had maintained incredible genealogical records, not focused on whether they were Jewish or not, but these records were available to Nazi Germany. And he had made this decision to leave Germany in before 39, I guess, before the war began, September. And he left Germany and moved to England and was taken care of by colleagues at the British Interplanetary Society of Germany, and then came to the United States. And we became great friends in New York because I was working in New York, A, for Reaction Motors, which is east of New York, and B, for Republic, which is Reaction Motors is west of New York, and Reaction Motors and Republic Aviation, which is east of New York. And so we became very close friends. I lived in Long Island, he lived in Long Island, and we were really close friends. And he died just before the Apollo 11. It was
sort of unexpectedly?
Unexpectedly. He lived through Apollo 10 in '68, but he died unexpectedly from a heart attack. And I mentioned in my mentions he hadn't organized himself well for this. And so Frederick ran, and I sort of helped out with Olga. And shall I talk about these?
Sure.
So we knew that Willie Lay had an incredible collection, not only on early space flight and astronomy, but also on his field, which is originally paleontology. A world-class collection. And I had advised people at Yale and at Harvard and at Carnegie Tech and Bill Holly up at Duke and so forth of this collection, because I was in this circuit. And so we were able to bring this collection to Huntsville, Alabama. I had talked to Olga Lay following the death of Willie. I visited her. They were in Long Island, up Jackson Heights, and I was a little further out on Long Island, and she wasn't. I knew the house. That house was incredible. Everything was books, even in the bathroom.
Oh, really?
Willie Lay had his toilet seat here, and a big shelf of books right in front, so you could pull out a book and read there. Yeah. It was incredible. Anyway, beautiful.
He must have been quite a reader.
Incredible collection. And Olga Lay had begun to, after Willie's death, had begun to receive queries from book dealers in Boston, New York, and other, antiquarian book dealers interested in segments of the collection, the jewels of the collection.
Yes.
And I had persuaded Olga. I said, Olga, that collection has got to stay intact. I remember this very clearly. Maru and I would spend many evenings with them at their place, and they were in our place. We were very close friends. And I said, that collection deserves continuity and one place, and that's when I talked to Ben Graves. And I had got to know Frank Rose quite well. We were very close in many things, and I saw Frank Rose for many years, even after he retired, and went up to Alexandria in Washington. And of course, Werner von Braun, Eberhard Rees, Ernst Stuhlinger, and so forth. So we had the support of many people here in Huntsville, Alabama, for bringing that exhibit of that collection here. The problem was, of course, they couldn't operate as quickly as she needed for her economic situation. I didn't know all this ahead of time, but things sorted out later. And so I said, I will buy the collection. She agreed, and then I bought, I think we paid 15 or 20, whatever it was, $20,000. I need those things out there. But I paid for it anyway, and they paid me back, the university. And we bought the collection, this marvelous collection, a world-class collection, to here in Huntsville, Alabama, from Ordway.
And it's still here and still used.
Still here and still used, yeah. Springfest in 1971, we had a symposium here.
At the time of the opening
at the time of
the
official opening here at the university, of the Research Institute, component of the university, of the Willie Lay collection. And we had Governor Wallace came. We didn't expect it, but he did come. Made some nice comments. Olga Lay is here. You can delete this if you want.
No, go ahead.
She was at the head table with Governor Wallace, and she refused. And so we talked to Governor Wallace's handler in organizing the event. And he said, well, Olga Lay's a very retiring, shy woman, and she would really not prefer to be at the head table. And that was no problem at all. So she started another table here in Huntsville, because she was, you can imagine in those days, she was a very liberal New Yorker.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's something you can delete if you want. And but that went very well.
That's part of history.
Part of history.
That's the real history.
And there was a Postmaster Blunt lunch,
yes,
in those days. And then there was a reception at my house, a reception at Vernon Brown's house. We had dinners. And the symposium, and Derek de la Sola Price came down from Yale. He was a good friend of mine, and Mel Kransberg came down, and I don't have the complete list, unfortunately. I introduced the symposium, and Dave Christian talked a bit about the organization of the collection. Olga Lay made a few remarks. I mean, it was a very, very nice event. Unfortunately, I don't have that.
Well, I think we have in the archives down here. With the
yeah, you probably do. I have it out there, but I can't get it.
Well, we have it downstairs.
Yeah. But it was a very successful event, very high level, fully supported by Von Braun, by Reese, by Stuhlinger, by Rose down at Tuscaloosa, and many others. So that we were very, very proud to bring that collection to here in Huntsville, Alabama, and have a world-class symposium, a world-class historians of science to backing it. And we had, Elliot Everett Mendelsohn at Harvard, which is a guy I knew quite well from my days, was fully behind it, and De La Sola Price at Yale, and Mel Kransberg, Bill Hawley up at Duke. I mean, with that, they really respected what we were doing here, and we had that backing.
Let me ask you a question that's maybe out of the blue. The republishing rights, or the copyright rights to the Willie Lay books came with the collection. Are there some that should be reprinted, do you think?
Oh my God, I don't know that. I mean, that...
I realize it's out of the blue to ask.
It's out of the blue. I just don't know. I haven't been here. I haven't been here for 36 years.
Yeah, but you know the Willie Lay fictions.
Yeah, I know it very well. He wrote it, yeah, sure.
And all of it's out of print, I think.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. So I couldn't imagine any problems, but I just don't know.
Well, we have the rights to do it.
You have the rights, yeah.
So the question is, would it sell, do you think? Would it be a...
Oh, boy.
You know the science fiction field well.
Yeah, I would think so. He wrote, he wrote under a pseudonym, Robert Willie, was it?
I have forgotten.
He wrote under fiction. He said he was not trying to hide it, but to separate it from his nonfiction. I think it's Robert Willie. Yeah, I would think so, and I certainly look into it.
Well, we'll look into it too, but it's one of the questions that has come up as we come up on this 50th anniversary of these things. Would it be in the interest of the scientific community?
I would think so, to have maybe
republish something.
Maybe a compendium of some of his major science fiction works. It's interesting because he worked in both fields, and of course in paleontology. And I know that all these historians that I mentioned from my epoch back, in 60s and 70s, knew of him, and he was highly regarded. So I would think so.
Was he careful to keep track of real science and not get too far afield in fantasy in his science fiction?
I think he did. He was a member of the VFR back in Germany. He was a solid thinker. He wasn't trained in the sciences as Werner von Braun was, but he was a self-educated to a great extent, but fascinated in science, and is very, very, cognizant in the field of paleontology, biology, which fascinated him, which also fascinates me, and was right there at the beginning. So I think that a Willie Ley collection could be of interest. Yeah, sure.
We'll have to look into that.
Let's look into it.
I was just, well, I had a chance. I was interested in your opinion on that.
With you, and I'll work with you.
All right, good. Well, any other things that went on during your period with the research institute?
Well, we were looking at, we had a source book on environmental studies. We had a project called ASTRED, the application of research and technology to emerging countries. We did quite a few things in those areas. I don't have all the reports. That's the trouble. Memory doesn't bring them all because they're all out at the center.
I think you said you were quite interested in application of technology to
application of technology to social problems using Saturn and Apollo and Skylab and the ideas. And this is something that Werner von Braun got into at the same time when he went up to work with Ed Yule at Fairchild. And I was closely involved with him. He made many trips to India and Iran and other countries doing this. And I was lecturing on this subject, ad nauseum, during that period of time.
Incidentally, we have one of his lectures on that subject in our archives online.
Oh, you do?
We do.
Okay, good. I guess I should mention...
From that period, this period.
I should mention then the Antarctic experience.
Oh, yes, by all means.
I was closely involved with the National Science Foundation for many years. And Bodo Bartolka was one of my close friends there, and others. Phil Smith, who ran the polar program and so forth, and I was up there on meetings on behalf of the university, bringing contracts in and so forth. And they said, Fred, they had sent Werner von Braun and Ernst Stuhlinger and Bob Gilruth from Houston to the South Pole.
Yes, I knew of that.
They were doing studies there, I think in Austro summer '69, looking at the parallel between what's happened in Antarctica and what could happen on the moon. Research at the long end of a logistic change under very harsh environmental conditions. Those are the words.
Yes.
And so I was the second team they wanted to come down, and with this resulted in a number of very fine publications in Advances in Space Science and Technology, which is I was the editor of later. So they invited me down for the Austral summer 1970, 1 month. And I visited almost all the major stations down there. And a couple, I guess, anecdotes would be fun. But,
yes, please.
My roommate at McMurdo, where we arrived by plane from New Zealand, from Christchurch. We were all outfitted in Christchurch. That's where the United States Antarctic Research Program, USAR, was based. And when people came in like me, we were all given briefings there, and our clothes, and the whole works. And then we flew down and became ski planes. And on the way down, we had the standard advisory from the cockpit about what we should do in case of an emergency. And they went through the routine, which was standard for any airplane, except that the pilot afterwards said, if we do ditch, we got about 20 seconds or something, or 30 seconds, whatever it was, in this frigid Antarctic Ocean. But we arrived in there, it was incredible. They have these whiteouts, but where it's completely cloudy above, completely white here, and you don't see anything. But these planes come in and land on the McMurdo ice cap, the ice sheet there, which is frozen. Well, it came in like this, and then you go in to the base, protected by these brilliant orange, guidelines. And I was there for 1 month. They took me everywhere, the South Pole Station. They put me in a field team of the Carapace Nunatak, which was, he flew you out in a helicopter and left you out there for 2 or 3 days on your own. You're doing field geology. And the thing is, you were finding fossils of tropical entities that, you know,
Yes.
in the Antarctic. I mean, it was incredible. I mean, a fascinating thing.
It turned out to be even more incredible with time.
Yeah, and I was also there on the first time that they had women scientists down there, just by coincidence. And I got along with them. They were sort of by themselves. They were from Ohio State University.
Oh.
And we had lectures and so forth. And it was fascinating. I went through all the major bases. And we always landed on about a C-130 on skis. And when we got to the South Polar Station, it was so cold that they left the motors on 24 hours a day. And then we had a photo opportunity. We rushed out in the slippers and a towel and got a picture at this incredible temperature. You know.
I've seen the comparable pictures with Ernst and Frederick.
Yeah. And another little thing, I became very interested in the history of polar exploration because of that trip, and I guess earlier, that exploration. And back in Christchurch, I think after the trip, we had some debriefing and so forth. I had some time on my own. I went to a book, see, look, I'm a book guy. I had a huge collection of books, you know. That's a whole other story. And I found this amazing collection of polar books in this bookshelf. My God, this is all the original stuff, you know, published in the 19th century, the early 20th century. And so I bought the entire collection.
Oh, really?
But I didn't have the money with me. But I had a check drawn out in a Huntsville bank. So I said, well, to the book deal, will you accept a U.S. dollar check on a bank in Huntsville, Alabama? He said, of course. That was in the old days, you know, that was in the 70s. Mm-hmm. And so I wrote a check for these books. And I said, would you like my identification, my passport? Oh, of course not, sir. Of course not, sir. Imagine that today.
Yeah, well, so you got the books.
I got the books, and there a lot of them are over the Spacer Market Center. I think some I actually sold, because I did sell some books at one point because the Spacer Market couldn't protect them. And so we had a sale in New York. It's another story. I'll tell you about that. But I had one of the world's collections of
polar books.
Polar books and lunar books, you know. Back in the 1600s, I had many books in the 1500s.
Well, how did your relationship with the Research Institute be completed?
Yeah, that was a very difficult thing. Ever since I moved down here to Huntsville, and I love Huntsville, but I always planned to go back north. I'm a bloody New Englander, but our family goes back to the 1634 when James Ordway arrived from England. Yes. He arrived on the Mary and John. I have a copy of his ticket, and he arrived in what was now called Old Dorado, was in Newbury, Massachusetts, by longboat from Ipswich, where they actually landed. And I've been up there. I've been a member of the first Sons and Daughters of the first settlers of Newbury. And I was brought up in Maine. I've told you all that. And I didn't plan to stay south, much as I love Huntsville. And I had an opportunity. I said, I'm looking for the opportunities to get back north, where I had so many activities. I'm in all kinds of genealogical societies and God knows what else. And so in 1974, I accepted a consultancy with the National Science Foundation with Russ Dew. We've been very good friends. They worked in to look into some of the things that might be applicable to Latin America. and I did a report for him. And then I went to South America for a while, did a lot of family stuff, and I came back. Well, the main thing was percolating there was with Bob Siemens. You remember Bob Siemens?
Oh, I knew him well, yeah.
We became quite close to in the Apollo years, and he was named by President Ford the head of the Energy Research and Development Administration. And he knew that my original field was that. And at the time he was the president of the National Academy of Engineering, we had set up a meeting at the Cosmos Club, and he said, "Fred, I want you," just like Werner von Braun did. So I joined.
And that's a whole new story.
That's a whole new story.
And maybe that's a good place to end this interview.
Perfect.
But I always like to ask at the end, are there any comments you'd like to make for the young people these days? What bits of advice from an old timer who's been through it all?
Oh, God. I've been through a lot. I was very, very happy here in Huntsville, Alabama. The work that we've done here, I think, is incredible. I mean, this is the city that should be proud of the fact that it put man on the moon.
Well, it is.
And yeah, but the bloody license plates aren't selling like they do in North Carolina. But anyway, this was a great city, a great community, and I'm very proud to have been part of it. I have to apologize that I'm not planning to retire here, because my background is New England. I come from an old New England family going back to the 17th century, and I feel more comfortable doing my work there. But I'm down here now. I have a home here. I go back and forth, and I love it, and I recommend anyone. And I have friends, by the way, that have been. I was invited to the opening of the Missile Defense Agency, a big building up there. Well, they picked on me, but I was there. I was very impressed. 5,000 people in that new building coming down from Arlington, where I've been living, and
I've seen it.
There's been some problem, of course, as always, to get people to come to Alabama, not specifically Huntsville, but they're having some problems getting their contractors and other members down here. I give you full credit for doing an incredible job here in Huntsville. And when I came here, it was Watercress Capital, USA.
Right, that was what it was when I came to.
When did you come here?
54.
54. I came here 2 years later. A friend of mine, George James, did you ever meet him? George James is a very good friend of mine in Washington, who has prepared a document for Stewart, who's doing the Werner von Braun exhibit out here. He came down here in 52 as an American in the Army, and his career, he ended up mainly in Aerojet. And my career, of course, started as reaction motors. We became very, very good friends. And he sent down a long document, which I turned over to Stewart, which you might want to incorporate in the von Braun exhibit here in Huntsville.
Well, very good. Well, thank you very much for coming in today, and we'll pick up the rest of your career at a later date, because it surely deserves to be covered also.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chuck, one of my best and oldest friends here.
Thank you very much.